At the end of the 1840s, the situation in North Taranaki was tense, but there was a legitimate hope that time would ease these tensions. Economically, the region was doing well. There were around 3,000 people living in the vicinity of New Plymouth, about 1,100 Europeans, 1,100 Te Atiawa, and the remainder from Taranaki and other iwi. The European settlement had gained a lot of good farmland as a result of the land purchases of 1847 and 48, and new settlers were arriving to set up farms on these lands. The Māori people were growing in wealth as they supplied the European settlement with food, and increasingly the food surpluses were being exported to feed the Australian goldfields. In exchange, the Europeans made a fair bit of money selling manufactured goods to Māori. A number of Māori also earned money by working in New Plymouth or on the surrounding farms. However, there were unresolved issues resulting from the recent colonisation efforts. For Te Atiawa, there were a number of schisms within the iwi. Before 1840, there were only a few dozen people living in the area. Most of the iwi had gone to the Cook Strait region in the 1830s to support Ngāti Toa's conquests and escape Waikato attacks on North Taranaki. Another portion of the iwi had been taken back to Waikato as slaves. But in the late 1830s and 40s, the Waikato Māori had converted to Christianity and released their slaves. They had also stopped raiding the Taranaki region, and in the early 1840s had accepted money from the government to relinquish their claim to Taranaki. The former slaves returned home in the early 1840s, while a trickle of Cook Strait Te Atiawa turned into a torrent in 1848 as Wiramukingi led a migration of almost 600 back to their homelands. After almost 2 decades of separation, it was a difficult task to try and reintegrate these 3 parts of the iwi into a functional society. The presence of the European settlement made this task more difficult. A number of Te Atiawa saw the Europeans as an alternate source of power, and an alliance with them could give lesser chiefs wealth, power, and respect beyond their rank. The government exploited this fact. There had been no more land purchases since 1848, but the government had been gifting individual Māori cash payments in exchange for a promise to sell land in the future. This had created a section of the iwi that were actively promoting future land sales. The prosperity of the European town of New Plymouth was also slightly misleading. With the new lands came the ability for Europeans to begin exporting vegetables and wheat to the Victorian goldfields. In 1853, the town exported 8,713 pounds worth of goods, but by 1855 this had increased to almost 21,000 pounds of exports, with roughly 75% of that value coming from potatoes. But the cost of living was high, and it was difficult for people to gain enough capital to invest in their local businesses. In 1850, Governor Grey founded the New Plymouth Savings Banks in an attempt to help address this problem, but it had limited success in increasing savings or investment. In this time period in the British Empire, even a small level of prosperity was sufficient to attract people to the town, and New Plymouth grew rapidly. The population had increased to 1,532 in 1851, but by 1856 had reached 2,488, and 2,650 by 1858. Māori had outnumbered Europeans in 1848, but by 1856 they were again the minority in the province, with only 1,782 Māori recorded that year. Because of the rapid growth of New Plymouth, there was a desire for more land around the town, despite the extra acres gained in 1847 and 1848. The last of these were only settled in 1853, after the last members of the Puketapu Hapu opposed the sale agreed to accept the government's compensation for losing their land. However, the opponents resolved that this would be the furthest extent of Pākehā settlement. In April 1854, Ngāti Ruanui held a meeting of between 500 and 1,000 people of the various Taranaki iwi at Manuapo, where the collected people agreed that they would support each other not to sell further land to the government. For Europeans, this came to be known as the Land League, and would be used as an example of the Māori conspiring together to usurp the powers of the legitimate government of New Zealand. However, for Māori it meant very little. It was only binding on those that attended, and even then it could not be enforced. Because of this, a Puketapu chief called Rawiri Waiawa was able to attempt to sell another portion of his hapu's land to the government. This was bitterly opposed by Wātili Katatore, the man who had formed a party to attack New Plymouth in response to William Spain's announcement a decade earlier. The land Rawiri was attempting to sell included a disputed field farmed by one of Katatore's followers. The local land assessors told Rawiri to mark out the boundaries of the land he intended to sell, but the night before Rawiri set out to do this, Katatore sent a messenger to Rawiri's house and gave him a gun, telling him that if he wanted to do this, then he had better go armed. Rauali was not intimidated and did not take a gun with him, so when his party of 25 men armed with axes and spears met with Katatōle's 28s armed with muskets, it ended quickly. Katatōle fired a warning shot. Rauali and his men charged and 4 of them were killed and 12 wounded. Rauali was wounded and eventually died in New Plymouth Hospital. Katatōle retreated to his pa and awaited the response of Rauali's relatives and supporters and the European government. However, nothing happened for a time. Rauali's relatives had been convinced by missionaries to await European justice, but Governor Grey had just been recalled and his replacement had not yet arrived. Colonel Wynard was acting governor and decided not to intervene as the government did not have the authority to interfere in a dispute between Māori on Māori land. This led to a stalemate for a time. Katatōle tried to gain support from Ngāti Ruanui. He had been at the Manawa meeting and had joined the agreement. Katatōle sent messages to Ngāti Ruanui claiming that this was a dispute over a land sale, and Ngāti Ruanui had promised to assist others in retaining their land. But Ngāti Ruanui was not convinced. The gathered Māori at Manawa had laughed at Katatōle since he had recently sold land to the government. They suspected this was a personal dispute concealed as a dispute over land. Further, at Manawa the Te Atiawa leadership had not been present, and so their land had not been included in the agreement. Meanwhile, Rauali's supporters gathered around his relative Arauma Karaka. However, they did not have the numbers to launch an attack on Katatōle directly, and instead insisted that the government aid them in gaining justice for the murder of Wairere. A third force had also recently arrived in North Taranaki to add to the tension. Hinare Te Whare, the son of Te Puni from Wellington, had refused to accept payment for the last sale of land to the government. Instead, he came up from Wellington with 30 warriors and occupied part of the coastal land that he disputed with the government. At first he occupied around 500 acres of land, but as more people joined him from Wellington, he prevented Pākehā from settling around 1,200 acres of prime farmland. This standoff was broken in November when Ihaia Te Kilukumara of the neighbouring Otarawa, Hapu, had a man killed for committing adultery with Ihaia's wife, a crime which didn't usually come with a death sentence. This man was called Rumene, and he was a member of the iwi of Ngāti Ruahine and Ngāti Ruanui. Finally, the Ngāti Ruanui army that Katatōle had been asking for set out for Te Atiawa land. But the 300 warriors were not headed to defeat the land sellers of Puketapu Hapu, but instead to get justice for the death of Rumene. Ngāti Ruanui surrounded Ihaia's pa at Manaku, but Ihaia had expected retaliation and had fortified himself well, creating firing positions for snipers and using bundles of flax to make the walls of the pa impervious to bullets. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the fighting was even, with roughly equal numbers of casualties. That is until a significant force of Rauali's supporters arrived to assist Ihaia and managed to break the encirclement, allowing Ihaia to retreat to another pa at Mohautahi. Ngāti Ruanui decided that the casualties inflicted were sufficient to punish Ihaia for the deaths of Rumene, and left for home on Christmas Day 1854. But this meant that now Ihaia and the Otarawa Hapu were allied with Karaka's portion of the Puketapu Hapu, and skirmishes against Katatōle's supporters became a daily occurrence. Meanwhile, the Europeans had not let the development of open warfare amongst their neighbours go unnoticed. Donald Maclean was the first to respond, suggesting after the murder of Wairere that the settlers establish a 500-strong militia and maintain blockhouses to protect the settlement from the conflict he expected to follow. But he thought any less than 500 soldiers would only inflame the situation rather than act as a deterrent to violence. In November, the New Plymouth settlers attempted to set up a militia, but the provincial superintendent refused without the approval of acting Governor Wynard, and Wynard wasn't willing to provoke the situation further. Instead, he sent Major Nugent of the army to investigate and make recommendations on the situation. In January, Nugent advised the government not to do anything to inflame the situation. He noted that so far the settlers had not been hampered in their farms or trade, and that Wiramukingi at Waitola still remained neutral in this conflict, but both of these things could change if the government attempted to intervene in the conflict, and either would lead to greater difficulties for the settlers at New Plymouth. The government decided that instead of a militia or soldiers, they would send between 30 and 40 armed policemen to protect the settlement, the expense of which would be shared by the provincial and central governments. The New Plymouth settlers were not impressed. In March 1855, the provincial government passed a series of resolutions calling on the government to send soldiers to New Plymouth. The province even offered to pay for 400 soldiers itself. The settlers particularly wanted artillery, and they were very clear that this force would not be used just for defensive purposes, but to end any opposition to land sales between New Plymouth and the Waitara River. But Wainard remained staunch against settler pressure. That same month he had arrived in New Plymouth and began acting as a mediator between Katatole and Karaka. Katatole agreed to sell the disputed land if it would lead to peace, most likely because he was heavily outnumbered in the fighting at this point of time. However, Karaka did not agree. He had spent most of his life in the Cook Strait region, and had only returned to Taranaki after Waluri's death. Therefore, he claimed to not know the people or the land well enough to agree to sell. The offer remained open for a few months in case Karaka got the support of his people, but by April the peace talks had been abandoned. While this was happening, Ihaya had been causing trouble. He had dug up and desecrated the bodies of the Ngāti Ruanui warriors left behind in December. When Ngāti Ruanui heard about this, they were upset, but did not immediately respond. Instead, they went to the Taranaki iwi west of New Plymouth and proposed an alliance with them, but missionaries talked Taranaki out of the agreement and Ngāti Ruanui returned home. Karaka sent a letter to Ngāti Ruanui to join them in their fight against Katatole, but Ngāti Ruanui declined. However, Karaka made a mistake. Seeing they had the advantage in the fighting, he had occupied the disputed land and started building a pā at Nenia. This effectively ended the peace talks, but also made William Kingi reconsider his neutrality in the conflict. The pā at Nenia was uncomfortably close to Kingi's own land at Waitara, and with Karaka making the prospect of peace seem slim, Kingi sided with Katatole. In June and July the fighting intensified, and although the defenders of Nenia pā continued to hold their ground, casualties were increasing. It was at this point that the settlers finally got the soldiers they wanted. 400 from the 58th and 65th regiments, along with two 24-pounder cannons. However, these soldiers were not for offensive operations, and instead were limited to the immediate vicinity of New Plymouth. Wainard used his opening address of the third session of Parliament in August 1855 to inform Parliament of his attempts to make peace and the garrisoning of New Plymouth. Unfortunately, debate was muted. Parliament was constitutionally only supposed to run until July, and a number of MPs had resigned rather than come to an unconstitutional Parliament, and most of those that had come wanted to leave as soon as possible. Most MPs said they were not informed enough to support or oppose Wainard's actions. However, Thomas King, one of the New Plymouth MPs, heavily criticised the government's actions as effectively allowing Katatole and Kingi to drive Karaka into New Plymouth, where the settlers would be forced to take up arms. He proposed that the House of Representatives pass a motion saying that they could not support or oppose the neutral posture of these troops. The motion passed Parliament, but Wainard did not alter the neutral position that the troops took. Parliament also agreed to a £1,500 loan to the province of Taranaki to help see them through the current crisis. However, they declined to send any taxpayers' monies to support the military efforts in New Plymouth. Parliament blamed the agents that had encouraged Raruri to sell for the conflict, and the governor for letting it go on for so long, and they did not think that they should pay for the mistakes of the governor and his advisers. Wainard accepted their decision and paid for the troops and their barracks out of British funds. There was also a motion that the government recognise the Treaty of Waitangi in all of its dealings with Māoris. The vote on this motion was deferred until the next sitting of Parliament, where it seems to have been forgotten about. In September 1855, Gore Brown arrived in the country to take over as governor. He did not immediately take a stance on this conflict in Taranaki. However, he did send Wainard to make another attempt at peace negotiations in October, this time accompanied by Tapuni from Wellington and Tamati Wakanene from Ngāpui. But the negotiations failed in the same way as the last. Katatole was willing to sell the disputed land and make peace, but Karaka and Ihaya were not. By this time, most of Te Atiawa was growing tired of this conflict. Kingi was keen for peace. His main objective was to keep the fighting out of Waitara. Katatole had been wanting peace since the beginning of the conflict. There is some suggestion that he had actually not intended to kill Waruri in the first place. However, Karaka and Ihaya continued to refuse to formally make peace, although they did allow the fighting to subside over the summer. Instead, it was Ngāti Ruanui that remained to drive the conflict. A small party returned to the disputed land in autumn 1856 and ambushed a party of Karaka's supporters who continued to occupy it. 8 men died in the fighting. One of them was Piripi, the son of a leading Ngāti Ruanui chief. This led to a final large expedition from Ngāti Ruanui. 500 warriors arrived in June 1856 and surrounded Karaka's fortifications on the disputed land. Karaka, in a desperate situation, agreed to gift Ihaya some of the disputed land at Ika Moana if he aided Karaka against Ngāti Ruanui. In July, the assault finally came. Ngāti Ruanui was driven off and returned home after suffering equal losses to their opponents. However, this attack was what was needed to secure peace amongst the Puketapu Hapu. Katatori redoubled his efforts, as did Wirramu's kingi, and in particular Kingi's wife Hene. They visited as many of the combatants as they could to try and secure their agreement for peace. They were joined in their efforts by Waruri's widow and her son. However, Karaka and Ihaya would not agree. It was only Karaka's death to illness in January 1857 that allowed a peace to be agreed the next month. However, Ihaya did not agree to this peace. He had built a pa on the land at Ika Moana, and continued to fly his war flag over it and keep it fully garrisoned with warriors. This was a minor problem since no one else recognised Ihaya's claim to Ika Moana. Katatori did not think this land was ever Karaka's to gift away, and now Karaka's people were suggesting that the gift was not intended to be permanent, and that Ihaya should return the land. Ihaya was too weak to resist. He did not have enough warriors to defend both his pa at Ika Moana and his hapu's land further east. So while formally still in a state of conflict, there was no actual fighting. Instead, the conflict turned into a battle of competing land sales. Ihaya attempted to sell the land at Ika Moana. This may seem counterintuitive, but it was a reasonable move for Ihaya. If he could sell the land, it would prove that he was a legitimate owner of the land, and the Puketapu Hapu had given it away. It would also turn this land from a defensive liability into cash, increasing his power while decreasing his commitments. Of course, the key word here is if he could convince the government to buy the land. The New Plymouth settlers were eager for the government to accept the offer, but officials were more reluctant. Hulse, who would soon be appointed Assistant Native Secretary in Taranaki, recognised that the Puketapu Hapu would object to the sale, but suggested that perhaps Ihaya could be paid now, and the land taken in the future when Puketapu agreed and accepted payment. But Ihaya grew impatient while the officials were deliberating. In April, he entered New Plymouth and publicly announced that he was willing to sell Ika Moana and the Waitara River lands and lands to the north at Tūrangi. Of course, this is a lot of land that Ihaya had no claim to, and much of it was held by the followers of Wirramu kingi. Despite this, a number of prominent settlers supported the move, and kingi started to be seen in a negative light by the settlers. But the government still did not agree to his proposal. In July, he made a third proposal, this time adding Waionana to the offer, and he said he would accept payment in flour. But the government refused to accept the offer while it seemed likely to lead to further warfare in North Taranaki. Personally, I don't think Ihaya actually wanted to sell the land in question. He was most likely just trying to gain the settlers as an ally in his conflict against kingi and the Puketapu Hapu, which, if he won, would have left him as the unchallenged leader of Te Atiawa in Taranaki and an ally of the government. But Katatori did not allow Ihaya to gain the support of settlers without a fight. After the third of Ihaya's offers, Katatori offered 40,000 acres for sale. This land was inland from New Plymouth and included all of the disputed land except for Ihaya's at Ika Moana. Because the only claimants to this land were either Katatori's or Karaka's supporters, this sale was unopposed, and in August work started on surveying this land. Katatori suggested that he would be willing to sell the land at Ika Moana, but rejected Ihaya's claim to own the land, so would not be willing to sell if Ihaya also received payment for the land. The government finally intervened in this dispute. They offered Ihaya £200 to vacate Katatori's land. Ihaya refused. Basically, Ihaya had been diplomatically outmanoeuvred. For this next event, I'm going to discuss what happened first, then talk about why it happened later. On the 9th of January 1858, Katatori set out with a few supporters to a hotel in New Plymouth. He had been approached by provincial government representatives to clear the gorse from settlers' farms, and they were meeting to discuss payment. He met with Robert Paris, the district commissioner, and all accounts say that Katatori got very drunk that day. Ihaya was seen watching him around New Plymouth, and following a discreet distance behind Katatori as he rode home. On the route home, Tamati Te Raurau, Ihaya's brother, and a few other supporters of Ihaya waited in ambush inside a European farmer's home. As Katatore approached, the ambushers fired a volley and wounded Katatore's brother. Katatore dismounted, possibly to help his brother who had fallen from his horse, but seeing that the ambushers were charging at them, he instead walked his horse away. The ambushers beat Katatore's brother to death and hacked his body apart. As Ihaya and more of his supporters rode up, they joined together in a haka over what was left of Katatore's brother. Apparently they were not able to identify the beaten corpse. Katatore had walked about 800 metres down the road and had witnessed the brutality against his brother before 3 of the ambushers caught up with them. He too was beaten to death and his body was dismembered. So why did this happen? These events kind of don't make sense. Ihaya had murdered in the past, but he'd always been careful to only do so when he could handle the response. However, in this instance he knew that the other members of Te Atiawa had agreed to peace, and they would all oppose this murder. It is also worth noting that Ihaya is unlikely to have organised the ambush on chance after spotting Katatore in town. The speed of communication was simply too slow to arrange a party from his part to get in position in time, meaning he most likely had prior knowledge of Katatore's visit to the town. Also, it is a bit odd that the provincial government would offer to pay money to Katatore. The local settlers still generally supported Ihaya, and they would have been concerned that Katatore would have used this money to purchase weapons and ammunition. So, conspiracy theory time. I have no evidence, but I think the most likely explanation of what happened here is that some provincial government officials conspired to murder Katatore to restart the war with government troops supporting Ihaya, in order to get their hands on all the land that Ihaya had promised. This explains why they asked one of their opponents to provide labour for them. It explains how Ihaya knew that Katatore would be travelling on that day and would be vulnerable. It also explains why Ihaya was willing to pick a fight with the rest of Te Atiawa. He thought he would have the backup of the European government. And also why the local officials argued that Ihaya and his supporters shouldn't be punished, despite this murder happening on European land. But whether this theory is true or not, things would not work out this way for Ihaya. Before his death, Katatore had been working closely with Kauripa, who had succeeded Karaka as the leader of Rairui's supporters. With Katatore's death, the Puketapu Hapu united under Kauripa and demanded justice for this murder. William also wanted to bring Ihaya to justice. Katatore had been a friend and ally of his, and they had worked together for peace inside Te Atiawa. Unfortunately for Ihaya, Katatore's sister had married another William Te Matakatia, a man who had won fame as a sniper in the 1830s, and was now the paramount chief of Taranaki, west of New Plymouth. With all of Te Atiawa united against Ihaya and the support of Te Matakatia in Taranaki, Ihaya had little chance of victory in the conflict. He retreated to his pa at Ikemoana, but before his opponents could organise against him, he withdrew his forces to another pa at Karaka. Ikemoana was burnt to the ground, and everything left behind was either destroyed or sold to the settlers. The murder of Katatore had also caused distress amongst the settlers of New Plymouth. Ihaya was still well liked by the ordinary settlers of the town, despite having not received much favour amongst central government officials. The Taranaki Herald generally praised Ihaya and vilified Katatore, but still wrote, "Ihaya and his party, who deserve punishment for having planted their ambuscade within the settlement to the great terror and danger of some of the settlers who were unwilling spectators of the horrible murder. The impunity with which the government allows Maoris to do as they please in no way obliges the settlers to be quiet spectators of these outrages, or to submit to their homesteads being used, as was the case in the present instance, for ambuscade. To show the obvious duty of the government in this matter, we will suppose that some settler had, as was nearly the case, generously interposed between Tamati and his victims. The act would assuredly have cost him his life. We point this out to show how easily, as long as the natives are left to their own modes of redress and free to do as they please, we might be involved with them. The government was blamed for not intervening in the fighting sooner and allowing the conflict to reach the current situation. However, the Europeans were not particularly interested in justice for the murder of Katatore. Tamati Tarauro, who had led the ambush, actually lived in a very nice house in New Plymouth and relied on the protection of the government for his safety. Governor Gore Brown decided that this was the time for the British military to take a more active role. A few days after Ihaya's retreat from Ikemoana, he issued a proclamation that all persons whosoever who shall unlawfully assemble with arms within the boundaries described within the schedule to this proclamation will, without further notice, be treated as persons in arms against the Queen's authority, and active measures will be forthwith taken against them by Her Majesty's civil authorities and military forces. The proclamation covered all the Pākehā land around New Plymouth. Gore Brown also called out 300 of the New Plymouth militia to support the Imperial troops in the imminent conflict. However, there were legal issues. The 1844 militia law stated that the militia were for the defence of settlements only, not active military campaigns, and the entire militia was to operate as a unit. It was illegal to only call out a portion of the militia for offensive operations. This resulted in Colonial Secretary Stafford putting forward an updated militia bill. The 1858 bill allowed militia to serve anywhere in their district, and also for volunteer units to be formed which could serve anywhere for any length of time. The bill was passed with surprisingly little debate. At the same time, 300 pattern 1853 Enfield rifles were ordered from Britain. These were the most modern weapons of the British Army, and the Army troops in New Zealand were not even fully equipped with them yet. So these rifles represented a significant investment towards a future conflict. It seems likely that Gore Brown thought that the conflict between the government and Te Atiawa would happen sooner or later. However, sooner or later was not good enough for the Taranaki provincial government. They wanted the government to actively intervene in support of Ihaya. In May, they wrote a letter to Parliament and the governor urging this. They proposed an alternate explanation of the events of the ambush in January. They believed that the ambush had been planned by some of Kalipa's followers, who had wanted to get rid of both Katatole and Ihaya. They had planned the murders and tricked Ihaya into joining them in the conspiracy before scapegoating Ihaya and actively fighting against him. They claimed that all the opponents of Ihaya wanted peace, and that if the government intervened on Ihaya's side, there would be no war, since it would give Wilemukingi and Puketapu Hapu the excuse they needed to end the fighting. They then went on to call for a new system of land sales, allowing a minority of claimants to sell the land, and in a curious leap of logic claiming that this wouldn't lead to war since the vast majority of Māori wanted a minority to be able to sell their own land. They finished by calling for an inquiry into the present condition of the native inhabitants of this province, and into the causes which have led to their present difficulties, with a view to establish peace, order, and good government among the natives, and to encourage and assist them to dispose of the common lands they now hold, to the injury alike of themselves, the settlers, and the colony at large. However, the government did not follow their advice. Instead, they actively tried to defuse the conflict at Karaka. Ihaya had around 100 warriors, but his adversaries had 5 times that number, and maintained a very close siege of Karaka Pa. Chiefs from Waikato and Whanganui had gone to Ihaya and offered him sanctuary in their lands, but Ihaya refused. The government agent Robert Paris relayed an offer to Ihaya to give him land on the Chatham Islands, but Ihaya also refused this offer. Finally, in June, Paris and Ngāti Maniapoto leaders were able to convince Ihaya to leave the Pa and his besiegers to let him leave. However, Ihaya had one more trick left to pull. He left a few warriors hidden in the Pa with the intention on firing on the leadership of his opponents as they came to occupy Karaka Pa. But as they approached the Pa, they saw a dog walking over to the Pa, shaking its tail as if approaching its master. Robert Paris rode forward, spotted the ambush, and warned the others. The ambushing party then retreated and joined Ihaya, who had hidden with the rest of his forces nearby, and they retreated to Uranui, a village on the coast between Waitola and Mokau, and the Pa at Karaka was destroyed. This was the end of this phase of the Puketapu Feud, but a number of settlers were furious with how it had ended. Paris in particular was attacked. He was called a spy and an agent for Wilemukingi. Some thought that when he spotted the ambush he should not have warned Wilemukingi and instead had allowed Kingi to have been shot. With Kingi's death they thought that there would be no obstacle to future land sales around Waitola. This viewpoint was put forward in Parliament by Charles Brown, the MP for the Bell Block, and Alfred East, MP for Omata, who queried why the government had seemingly supported Wilemukingi and opposed Ihaya Te Kilikumura when Ihaya was a friend of the settlers. They also asked why the resident magistrate in New Plymouth had not enforced the governor's proclamation and arrested Māori men who had had weapons within the settlers' settlement. The government, in the person of William Richmond, Colonial Treasurer and MP for New Plymouth, argued that the proclamation had been explained to Māori as making groups of men gathering for conflict illegal, Therefore, the government would not arrest individual Māori or hunting parties. He also pointed out that by depriving Māori of their means of defence in the middle of a feud would likely drag the government into the conflict, and further accused the provincial government and settlers of not being interested in justice or peace, but instead only in the land that Te Ātiawa lived on. Colonial Secretary Stafford followed up this argument, stating that he had every wish to see the settlement expand, and he deeply sympathised with the settlers at New Plymouth, but the government were not going to buy land at the point of a bayonet. While Brown and East Motion was withdrawn, it was clear that the government in Auckland, its officials, and the provincial government and settlers of New Plymouth deeply disagreed. Meanwhile, the Māori of Taranaki worked towards peace. A formal peace agreement was reached between Ihaya and his enemies in August. Ihaya's sister also married into Ngāti Ruanui, helping to improve relationships with that iwi. Finally, the sale that Katatori and Kaurupa had been working on went through in a smaller form after some Cook Strait Te Ātiawa complained. The people of Katatori's village gifted their share of the proceeds to the family of Waririwaio as compensation for his murder. It seemed that Te Ātiawa would finally be able to live at peace again.